Hello, welcome to Seminar Activity 2 for this online session, and we'll be sort of briefly recapping some of the basics of report writing. So there's this video talking through the task, and then there's an activity sheet that I'd like you to look at with an example report that you're going to be using to do that. So at that point you will pause the video, have a go at those activities, and then start the video again. And we'll talk through some of the basics around report writing. Okay, so this is your activity sheet for activity 2. You're going to be reflecting on a sample report. So we're going to be doing something similar to the online seminar where we talk through reviewing examples of research proposals, but this time looking at an example report. And this report's just been chosen as an example. It hasn't been chosen specifically to reflect a good or bad attempt at a research report. That's something that you will need to decide as you're reading through it. Okay, so what we think is really useful is to have a look at an example of a research report and then really think about how it's been organised, how it's been laid out, whether it seems clear or not, the language that's being used, is it explained, does it all make sense? In terms of looking at different elements, are they explained clearly? For example, a theory behind the approach or the topic that's being studied. And does it draw together information on the subject area? Is it persuasive, and so on? So you're looking at the strengths and the weaknesses of the report and why they might be. So as you're reading through this, so read through it once and then look through these questions again and read through the report again and try and decide, jot down some thoughts around each of these questions. And you can do that under these sort of broader headings here. So things that you want to remember when you're looking at the organisation of the elements in the report and its layout, things you want to remember as you're looking through the descriptions and explanations about things, and then picking out the things that you want to try your own reports when you write them in the future. So that might be something like writing the individual differences report, or in semester 2, or it might be when you come to write up your own final year research project, things that you want to take away from it. So the example is this one here. As I said, it's just been chosen as an example that's available on online. So you can see that it's been edited at least to be partially in line with APA style. You'll need to decide whether you think that's fully APA style or not, but it's around distant intercessory prayer and task performance. So there's an abstract, and then the main body of the report starts here. So there's information about who's taken part, the methods, the results, and discussion. So this is quite a short example of a report, which is why it's quite good to review. So you'll always need to bear in mind the actual word limit of whatever report you're writing and sort of judge it for yourself. But it may give you an idea to read through this, reflect on what you think are the good aspects of this report, things that you think need developing, and so on. Okay, so pause this video now and have a go at that activity. Okay, so you've hopefully now had a read through this report. And you've reflected on the elements of it in terms of organisation, layout, clarity, persuasiveness, so the writing style, and where you think are the sort of strengths of this piece of work and where the kind of areas for development are. So as a guide, when you're writing a report, you should always check your assessment brief. So if it's for an assessment, check your brief first. There are usually specific guidance in that around what the markers will be expecting to see in different sections and so on. And that can be the best kind of first point of call in terms of knowing what you should focus on, what should be included. But there are some other resources that are useful sort of more generally, so I'm just going to show you those now. So there's a link to this on Blackboard, and this is something that was written by Andy Field in 2016 about writing up research, and it gives you a good idea of what should be contained in a report and, broadly speaking, the layout of that in relation to sort of APA style. And that really is about clarity. So making sure that you have all the information required so that someone can draw independent conclusions from your work and its implications without repeating yourself unnecessarily. So you don't want to see the same thing written multiple times. It's the idea is to use structure to signpost people to key information, and that can be presented in only one place. People will know where to look for it. So that's the aims of really what you're trying to do with your report. So Andy Field, for example, highlights that there should be a title, an abstract, an introduction, and then method section. Now, this is where you should look at your assessment brief in particular, because some of these sections, according to APA style, are optional, and it really depends on the type of research you're doing and why, as to whether they would be necessary. And you may be guided to what is required in your assessment brief because of that. But there should always be at least a participants and procedure section, but you may also need materials. Sometimes that's called apparatus if it's very experimental in design. For example, if you're perhaps using eye tracking equipment. A design, again, that's typically highlighting someone to, if it's qualitative research, the particular approach, worldview that you might be using, or it could be if you've got a very complex experimental design, identifying what your IVs and DVs are and how they're controlled and things like that. If you're using lots of measures, you might have its own dedicated scoring section, but that tends to be less typically used. Then you should have a results section, a discussion section, references, and again your appendices. An appendix is optional. So APA recommends that titles should be no more than 12 words, and that's to avoid wordiness, essentially. So you should be able to communicate the topic and the approach within the title so that someone has a clear idea of what you've done and how you've done it. And Andy Field gives some examples there. He gives an example of abstract, so in terms of kind of the size of it, again, be guided by your particular assessment or your particular brief. And then he takes you through the introduction. Now, the introduction in APA style shouldn't have a heading called introduction. It should just start on a fresh page. So that's something to remember. And then your method section. This is really useful because it gives an idea of what should be contained under each subheading so that you try to minimize repetition, and that if someone's reading your research, you're using these headings to signpost them to where to find that particular information. So it should all be really clear, really easy to read, and really easy to find the information they're looking for. So if you've got information around participants, then in terms of who took part, how are they selected, that should be in your participant section, for example. You don't want your reader to have to go hunting around in your report to find things. So there's some examples here about design, procedure, results. And it's important to say that in your results, you're providing a clear description of what you've done and how you've done it and what you found. You might be unpicking some of the results, so for example, descriptive statistics, but what you're not doing is interpreting them in relation to context. You're not interpreting them in relation to your hypotheses, so you're not saying that you've supported your hypotheses or so on. That information should be contained in the discussion section. So your discussion section is where you start to summarize your main findings, you relate it back to perhaps your original predictions, your aims, your hypotheses, and then you start to contrast it and discuss it in relation to the existing literature, and that's the literature that you will have brought our attention to in your introduction section. One of the things that's really important when you're writing reports is to make sure that you leave enough time to go through and edit. So it's unlikely you'll just be able to sit down and write all of this in one go. You'll need to draft bits out, and then you should go through a process of editing to make sure that the information's in the right sections, that it all flows together, and that it all makes sense. So I recommend this PDF. You can see where I found it here, but if you type in Andy Field and writing up research, you'll find this PDF. It's very useful. But I also thought I'd show you something called the APA Style blog. So the APA Style blog is a really useful series of posts by people who know a lot about APA style. And you can find all sorts of things. So there's a really useful paper here about effective writing in terms of avoiding plagiarism. So you really need to make sure that you're not writing in such a way that it looks like you're taking credit for other people's ideas, or that you're just copy and pasting essentially what they've said. You need to be rephrasing and kind of paraphrasing what they've said effectively. So there's some guidance around here. There's also some information around the active voice and passive voice. So APA style has a lot, or people have a lot to say about passive and active voices in relation to writing up research reports. And different tenses are advised for different sections of an APA formatted report. For example, some things need to be in the past perfect tense, and so on. So it's kind of worth looking at that. And if you have any concerns around that, I really would recommend having a look at the APA publication manuals, the hard copies that are available in the library, and have a read through them, because they provide the most detailed guidance on this. But this will take you through quite a nice discussion of what the different sorts of passive and active voices are, and how they're used. And a lot of the time it's thinking about what you're writing about in terms of choosing the right type of voice, active or passive voice and tense. So the publication manual has a lot more detailed guidance, but this blog post has quite a nice introduction to that. And there's something that I know I have issues with: wordiness. So again, there's a post here about good scholarly writing and avoiding wordiness, and it really does have an impact on your report writing. So if you can communicate your ideas more concisely, then that's what you should be doing, because you're more likely to keep your readers engaged, you're less likely to confuse them, or for things to be ambiguous. So that's why it's worth having a look at this blog post. But again, the APA publication manual has some guidance around this under the title of Economy of Expression. So that's something that's really worth having a look at. And you might want to look at the example, now that we've gone over some of this. Have a look back at that example that you've read and think, actually, is there something that you would change, or that, say, if you were reviewing this, what would you suggest to the person to improve their writing style, or not? So what do you think they're doing well and they should keep doing? And one last thing to always bear in mind, so if your report writing is for an assessment, look back at your marking grid as well. So make sure you're checking the relevant marking grid, but this is the sort of generic report writing marking grid. And just think, am I hitting all of these criteria? Look at the difference between an A and a C, for example, and see where that kind of difference lies. So, for example, empirical and theoretical evidence, an A grade is around drawing relevant information, not just like a scattergun approach, including everything you can find, but relevant information so the reader can see it's relevant from a range of sources, not just borrowing heavily from a couple of sources, but a range of sources, so that we can see patterns across the literature, and that you're drawing on both theory but also empirical evidence, that research evidence, and you're combining those. And that's where you'll see the really high grades. A lower grade, but a pass grade, would be around containing some relevant information, so some perhaps isn't, or there isn't enough. You are using a range of sources, but it's perhaps not as large, as wide a range of sources as it could be. So always bear in mind that you've got marking grids if you're writing reports for assessments, and use that in your drafting stages and in your editing stages to make sure that you're really hitting all of those criteria. Okay, so if you have any questions about this activity, please post them to the discussion forum. But hopefully this has been useful in making you think about research reports in in different ways, and how you can use that to inform your own report writing. Thank you.